Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into disabilities and more specifically how to treat people with disabilities. So as I mentioned last week, this month is Dwarfism Awareness Month. And when Mark and I first started discussing this topic, we wondered about being politically correct because sometimes people, they prefer to call it differently abled. And so I came to the conclusion, I think Mark agrees, that really intent matters. And
Right. I think how we got into this was some people prefer little people
yes.
as the designation.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the problems, I think, as we talk about political correctness is that it seems to me that terms that we're supposed to use or that people expect people to use are changing all the time.
Yes.
And I think that's correct. They often change. And so, with the LGBTQT community, and I think I'm leaving some letters out, I can't keep up with it. And it doesn't mean that I don't have respect or that I don't treat those people. It's just to try and keep up with all of the designations is a bit time consuming.
Yeah.
So when you talk about intent, I think that I've run into two groups of people. And one is there are clearly people out there who intend to be rude and disrespectful.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And, there's nothing I think anybody can do about those people, but it's clearly that's what they want to do. And we're not excusing those people at all.
Right.
But then there are people, and I think I fall into this category, who I want to be respectful, but often it's hard to know what term a particular person wants when there are multiple terms that could apply. And so I think the important thing is if you run into someone and you might use an inaccurate term, hopefully that person can gently say, well, I prefer this. And, then you can accommodate them. But I think it's unreasonable to expect everybody to know whatever the correct terms are in the moment. At least that's the way I feel.
And I tend to agree with that. Our intent here is to bring awareness and to elicit compassion. Right. So, that is very, very much our intent. And so we don't want to say or do anything to offend people. That's the exact opposite of what we're trying to do. And so I think, again, it comes down to, I believe in giving people grace.
Yes.
And
I agree with that. But I think it's also about behavior. I think that we get too hung up on terms.
Yes.
When really we ought to be focusing on behavior and how we treat each other or how we treat those who are differently abled. So.
Yeah, right. And my goal in life is just to be kind and respectful towards people in general. Yes. I mean, when I meet someone for the first time, I try to smile, I try to be kind, I try to be polite. And that's how I genuinely live my life. So I hope nobody walks away from today's episode feeling offended because it's not our intent.
Right. And I want to acknowledge again, I've certainly run into people who are not kind and they want to create, controversy and by using the wrong terms. That's not us though.
No, not at all. Not at all. Okay. So the main theme of today's episode is going to be kindness, empathy, and respect. That's going to be kind of our episode in a nutshell, because I think that's how everybody wants to be treated, is with that kindness, empathy, and respect. And we're going to be able to kind of apply this to a overall broader theme beyond disabilities, and that's treating people who look, act, or speak differently than you. So, foreign people is a really good example, or someone who is culturally different, someone who is dressed completely different than what you might be used to. I mean, I think it's best just to, if you don't know something, ask a question, ask them about it, and just be polite. And I think that's going to get you a long way in life. So let's talk about how to react when you see someone who has an obvious physical disability. What do you do?
Yeah. So, as a general rule, I think that one of the things that happens is when we encounter someone who is different in any of the ways that you just, went through. I think there could be an element of fear
Mm-hmm.
because, in past episodes, we've talked about how it's kind of this natural way we create the us and the them. And I think evolutionarily speaking, there's this predisposition to be afraid of those who are different than we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think you have to really be aware of that often you see someone, like let's take about a mental health issue. And there are certainly, say, homeless people who are walking down the street. Some of them are often, they're talking to themselves or, waving their arms about. And
Mm-hmm.
so they appear, when they're different, we don't know what their behavior is, but often they're generally just, people who are trying to make it in life and they, may have some mental health issues, but there's no reason for us to be afraid of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's fear that we have to overcome more than anything before we can then be kind and sympathetic and respectful to them. And so that's going to be, I think, an initial response for many people upon encountering someone who's different is that fear.
Yeah. So I remember this specific interaction I had with a Down syndrome kid, and I had never had much interaction with kids who had Down syndrome. So I was preparing for this. It was a dance festival, and it was through my church, and a big group of kids, teenagers, we were getting together and we were all learning a specific dance. And this Down syndrome boy was participating. And so I was partnered with him at one point, and he kept looking right at my chest. And it made me really uncomfortable. And I was like, okay, what is going on? And so I went to my friend who knew him and I was like, okay, that was really weird and I was uncomfortable. And she said, no, it's your shirt. And that day we had decided to wear these bright, vibrant, obviously just neon colors. Like
Uh-huh.
we made an effort. It was a thing. And she's like, it's your shirt. He's drawn to the color on your shirt. And I said,
Mhm.
oh, okay. But I mean, again, I didn't know. And it was that fear and that was just that discomfort. And so I really think ask questions is really the biggest thing that you can do.
Right. And so let's see some of the things you listed. Specific disabilities, someone in a wheelchair, someone who is hearing impaired, dwarfism, autism, Down syndrome. One of the things I was grateful for in my training is I spent time there's a clinic in Salt Lake. I can't even remember what it's called because it's changed. Like now it's called the Autism Center for Learning.
Okay.
Anyway, I spent 6 months in the autistic classroom.
Okay.
And once you get used to the children,
Mhm.
then you aren't afraid anymore. The other thing, I was doing research. I think this is back as an undergrad. I was doing research with Tourette's syndrome. And
Okay.
so Tourette's syndrome, mostly it's about tics, but one of those vocal tics can be shouting obscenities, although that's not that common for people. But so we were working with kids who had Tourette's syndrome. And so you get used to how these people behave in a different way. And it's not frightening, it's just different. And so I
Mhm.
think that's what we have to keep in mind. It's not threatening, it's just different.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say, I remember having an experience as far as in a wheelchair. And so about 7 years ago, I had a major back operation. I was out of the office for 4 months while I was recovering. But prior to that, for about 3 to 4 months, I couldn't walk very well. And so I was in a wheelchair and using a walker. So Lindy and I, we'd go out to dinner and we'd have this wheelchair and I'd get in the wheelchair. So we went to a restaurant in downtown, the Oasis, I remember, and that's the one that we go to. And we ran into this couple who we hadn't seen in a while, but we'd been friends with because our children went to the same school. And so here I am in a wheelchair. They'd never seen me in a wheelchair. They,
Mhm.
we certainly knew each other. I'd been at their house. I think they'd been at our house. They would not look at me or talk to me. So they
Weird.
interacted with Lindy. I'm sitting right there.
Hmm.
I'm looking up at them and I knew these people and they wouldn't look at me or talk to me because one, I guess it was different. They didn't expect it. And I
Yeah.
think they didn't know how to react. When you
Mhm.
could really say, be honest and say, well, I haven't seen you in a wheelchair before, which was true
Right.
for them, which would then I'd be able to say, well, here's what's going on. but otherwise, it's like I felt invisible.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if a lot of these people that we run into who are differently abled often feel invisible because we try and ignore them because we don't know how to interact with them.
And I understand that perspective too, that I don't know how to interact. And honestly, from everything I've heard, you just ask a question. And that's what your friends could have easily done. In fact, that's what I probably would have done. Oh my goodness, what happened? You're in a wheelchair. I mean, you
I
weren't the
was
last time I saw
right,
you, so
I
what
was really
happened?
shocked.
Yeah.
I I can still remember it because it was so shocking
Yeah.
that they ignored me. So it gave me a good idea of what a lot of people go through on a regular basis
Yeah.
of feeling invisible. And I think people don't want to feel invisible. Of course, we don't want to feel invisible.
Yeah.
It's kind of an obvious statement to make. And
Hmm.
so when we go back to how do we treat people who are different than us with kindness, empathy, and respect, I think inherent in those three things are not ignoring them,
Yeah.
but acknowledging, talking to them in any way that seems appropriate. If there's a caregiver, often there's a caregiver, you can start the conversation with, you know, the caregiver. And if, for instance, if there's no language ability, sometimes there is no language ability.
Hmm.
I think it's more just being comfortable being around people who are different and not being afraid.
Yeah. So I think a good example of this is most people, I think, know that if you're interacting with someone who is hearing impaired, and sometimes they can read lips and they can speak, sometimes they don't and they don't want to. Sometimes they rely on an interpreter. And so I think
Mhm.
most people by now know that if you are talking to someone who is hearing impaired, when you're talking to them, you look at them, not the interpreter.
Right, right,
So, but that's a good example of if you don't know, you don't know, right? And so it can be a little bit of a learning curve, but I mean, again, hopefully you only make that mistake once and then you know. So another good point is I was talking to a friend who was the one that informed me that October is Little People Awareness Month. And her son has dwarfism. And
hmm
so she said Little People Awareness Month. And then I asked her, I was like, so what's the correct way? What's the correct way to say it? Is it little people or is it dwarfism? And she said it's both, like it's either. And a lot of it comes down to preference, but dwarfism is a medical term.
right,
But if you look at someone and just say, and just call them a dwarf, they're probably going to be offended.
right.
And again, I think it really comes down to intent, right?
Well, yeah, I think that it's the way you approach someone because
Yeah.
you don't necessarily say, "Oh, I see you're a little person." I mean, there'd be no
Yeah.
reason to do that.
No.
I think what you want to do is treat them in every way that I hate the term normal, but treat them as if that disability is not a disability. Is that
I
you
think
might
it does. So
yeah.
because if you and this is what my friend said to me. She said if you ask him, he would say he's not disabled, but
Uh-huh.
he does need accommodation. And
Right,
so I think that's important to remember is and it's the same thing with people who are deaf or who are hearing impaired. They don't think of themselves as disabled because it's all they've ever known their whole lives. And so that's why they like to call themselves sometimes differently abled.
differently
It's
able. Yeah,
yeah, it's because they don't see it that way, but we can't ignore the fact that they do need an accommodation. For example, if you are deaf and you need an interpreter, right? And now that's not saying that we shouldn't give those accommodations because absolutely always 100% accommodations should be given. And I think for the most part, we do a pretty good job of that where we can. I mean, of course, there's always room for improvement, and I am sure there are people who have run into problems with being disabled and not getting the accommodations that they need. But as a society as a whole or in general, I think we at least try to do that.
well, yeah, the ADA certainly is one way that society has tried. And, I think that's a good thing to at
Yeah.
least make those physical accommodations. But in most businesses, I think, try to comply as best they can.
Yeah. And so I really think it's just about the dialogue and how you approach someone and how you treat them.
Yeah.
Because most people, they don't want to be treated differently because they look different.
hmm
And so, I think you just try to treat them like you would everybody else.
And so the empathy piece, is which we've talked about empathy maybe in every episode we've done because it's one of the common themes. I think it's one of the things that is missing
Mm-hmm.
in our culture as a whole. But
Yeah.
the empathy is trying to put yourself in the emotional place of the other person, which I think is really important. And so, in any of these different abilities that we've talked about, so for instance, mental health issues,
Yes.
which is the one I'm certainly most familiar with. I think that it's really important to have empathy for what
Mm-hmm.
the person is going through and, perhaps even what their life experience has been and, how hard it might be for them to be able to get along in society.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can be the one person who treats them kindly, who doesn't ignore them, who actually sees them, then that can really feel validating because they are people who have feelings just like any other. I think you mentioned in our outline that for them often, well, you mentioned the little person who didn't feel like he was differently able, well, he didn't feel disabled, he was probably
Mm-hmm.
different. But this is the ways, some of these people have been all their lives. And
Yeah.
so for them, this is what life is. And
Mm-hmm.
they certainly know they're different, and they certainly know they may need accommodations, and they certainly are treated differently by society, which is sad. And sometimes that's not a good thing. Sometimes they're not
Right.
treated well by
Yes.
people. And I really think it's out of fear mostly.
Yeah, I think so. And so I believe that the best remedy for that is to start with our own kids. I think it's important for our kids to see us reacting with people who may look or act different. And this obviously goes towards the realm of disabilities, but it goes into the realm of anybody who looks and acts or speaks differently than us. Teach them not to be afraid and teach them it's okay to be different.
I really agree with that. And here's the way I present it to couples. See, often with couples, what's missing in the relationship is empathy. And some people say, well, how do you make a difference in the world? And I think for me, it's you can try and make a difference, say, on a global level, which I think is really, really hard to do.
Yes.
But you can try and make a difference on, say, a local level. And
Mhm.
so the way I see couples work is if I teach them how to have empathy for each other,
Yep.
then they can then have their children and they can teach their children how to have empathy
Mhm.
for others. And in that way, that's how you spread it. So I really believe that being direct with your children about those who are differently abled,
Mhm.
who may, all the things that you listed, who may speak differently, look differently, that if we teach them not to be afraid and how to react and how to have empathy, that is a really important thing because then we build a generation of people who are going to behave differently than say we did or say our parents did when there wasn't a lot of awareness. If you look back to our parents' generation, there wasn't a lot of awareness for people who were different.
Right. Well, and there certainly wasn't as much awareness about mental illness as there is
Mhm.
today. And thankfully, we're getting better about mental illness and accepting that mental illness is a disability, just like anything else. It's a medical condition.
Right.
And, we're getting better at treating it that way. I mean, I see memes all the time. If someone breaks their leg, you wouldn't tell them to just walk it off,
Right.
right? You wouldn't. Right? Or if someone's in pain,
Suck it up.
genuinely,
Suck it up
yeah,
with that
suck it
leg.
up. Yeah. Oh, your leg's broken? Walk it off. So,
Yeah.
big deal. No, I mean, you go to a doctor and you get medical help. It is the exact same thing with a mental illness. If you are severely depressed or if you're severely anxious, you seek help. And it deserves the exact same compassion and accommodation as someone with a broken leg does. And we are getting better about that, about real recognizing the importance of just having a mental health day. Those matter. Those are important. And I'm all about that. I mean, with my kids even, we just need a day to not do school. Just a random
Mhm.
day to stay home and not do anything.
Mhm.
Those are good. So I like where we're going as a society, but there's always more work to do. And so again, I think it really just comes down to we got to start with our own kids. Just teach them not to be afraid, really. It's okay that someone looks different. It's okay that someone acts different.
Right. And so the way you're going to do that mostly is you can certainly talk about it, but it's to be out and for you to show by example how
Hmm.
you interact with people who
Yes.
might be different.
Yeah.
That we don't turn and walk away from someone who's different,
Hmm.
but you approach them as you would anyone else. And if the context is that you're going to have a greeting, then you greet them just as you would anyone else. And
Hmm.
so you treat them as much as you can like you do other people.
Yeah. And one thing that I do with my kids that I think is it's at least a step in the direction that we want to go is with religion. And again, I realize that comparing religion with disabilities is different because my religion is a choice. But I teach my kid it's that they're going to meet people who think and believe differently than they do, particularly about religion. And I teach them that it's okay that someone believes differently than we do. You can talk about it. You can learn from them and you can listen to what they have to say about their religion. And that's a good thing to do.
Right. So it's true, religion is different, but I think the concept is very much the same.
Yes.
That the overall concept of it is okay to be different,
Yeah.
and we are respectful and kind to people who are different than we are.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's really the same process that you're teaching. One is
Yes.
chosen, religion, and the other, being differently abled is not.
And one thing too is that I teach my kids is it's never okay to make somebody feel guilty or to feel bad because they make different choices than you. So my kids have grown up knowing our religious standards and they know our values, but we make sure to tell them not everyone holds to those same values. And it's never okay to make them feel guilty or to make them feel like they are less of a person or to make them feel like they're unaccepted because they make different choices than you do. And that same thing applies for people with disability. Don't ever belittle them or make them feel like they can't do something or talk down to them because they're different than you. The same concept applies.
Right. And I think that, with kids in school, either elementary, middle school, or high school, kids, for some reason, can be pretty cruel. Right.
Yes.
And so
Mhm.
I think as we teach our children to not make fun of others who are
Yes.
different,
Mhm.
and that could be religion, it could be the color of their skin, it could be, the accent in their language, or it could be, they're in a wheelchair or they walk with crutches or something like that. That you don't make fun of people who are different than you. And
Mhm.
that's a really important place that I think parents can have a really big impact on, shutting that type of behavior down pretty quickly.
Yes. Yes. And cuz I want to acknowledge that sometimes kids, like you said, they can just be cruel and sometimes kids will do something that is unkind.
Mhm.
And don't feel like you're a bad parent because your child did or said something because kids have a very, very underdeveloped prefrontal cortex and they are
Yeah,
very poor at
that's,
impulse control. And
that is
often,
true.
oftentimes they just make poor choices. And that is the time to correct it. You just say,
Use it
hey,
as a learning experience,
yes. Yeah.
learning situation. Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't make you a bad parent. It
No.
makes you the parent of a tiny human,
Yes,
which who
that's
has
right.
impulse controls. Yeah.
But I think parents need to take a more active role in teaching their children how to
Yes.
be kind to others, no matter
Mhm.
what the difference is.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I believe kindness in life or trying to be genuinely kind is going to take you further in the end.
Yeah.
And that old saying, nice guys finish last. Well, I would rather be in last place than be first and unkind,
Well,
right?
yeah, and I think I've mentioned this before because this kind of ties in. John Gottman, who does the marriage research, he has a program called The Heart of Parenting, and it's about emotion coaching.
Mhm.
But in his research, what he found was that the success of a child is more tightly linked to their emotional intelligence than it is to their ACT scores or how well they do
Interesting.
in school. And so when you think about it, it makes so much sense
Yeah.
because no matter where you are, or what you're doing, or how you're going to be successful, in the end, yeah, you may have to have some skills, but really it comes down to what type of people skills do you have? How do
Mm-hmm.
you connect and relate to other people? That's what he found made the real difference in a child's success. And that
Which,
is up to us. I really believe that is up to us
oh
as
yeah.
parents to teach our children those skills.
And that can sometimes involve labeling fear when it comes to
Hmm.
people who look and act differently. Help them recognize that their initial reaction is fear and they don't have to be afraid. Say, you're looking at this person, they look different. That's making you nervous or uncomfortable because you don't understand. How you're going to get past that is you're going to go interact with them. And then
Right.
you're going to learn that it's not scary, it's just different, and that's okay.
And what Gottman found in his emotion coaching is the labeling of emotions is really critical for
Yeah.
children. That is how indeed you teach empathy, is to
Mhm.
be able to label the emotion for them, because otherwise they don't learn it.
I think that must be the entire premise of Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood.
Oh, I loved it.
I
One of the sad things with my grandchildren getting older is we don't watch Daniel Tiger anymore.
Right?
I love Daniel Tiger.
Right? I mean, Daniel Tiger is fantastic. I
Yeah.
mean, because
I
it's
used to sing the potty song all the time.
yes. Yep.
I
Oh
don't
yeah.
anymore.
Yeah, we did too for a long time in our household, and we
Right.
probably will again because we've got a 3-year-old. But yeah, I mean,
Also, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was
that's
built on the same premise.
okay.
And for instance, he did things that for the time were really different. For instance,
Mhm.
he had a black person on and he was the mailman. And at the time, there was very little contact between blacks and whites. And what they did is the mailman was out delivering mail and he had a pail of water that to soak their feet. And they each took off their shoes and socks and put their feet in the same pail, which
Mhm.
in the same bucket of water for the time was really not done. And so
Yeah.
that was part of his Mr. Rogers deal was the acceptance of people who are different.
Yeah. And it starts young, and I think again it starts with that labeling that emotion. You
Right.
don't you don't
Yeah.
understand, or this person makes you feel nervous. This person makes you feel uncomfortable because they're acting different. Most
Mhm.
people don't act this way. Okay, well, let's go talk to them. Let's find out why.
Yeah.
Why what makes them act this way or what's different about them. Again, it's that fear of the unknown, and so how do you get rid of that fear? You make it
You approach
known.
it. You approach it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get closer to it. Further away you stay from fear, the bigger it gets. And so
Mhm.
I really like, what you've said about labeling the fear because otherwise the child knows there's something different and they're feeling something. But
Yep.
if you can then talk to them about whatever the emotional responses they're having, that's when you help them to understand it. And that is the start of empathy, is to be aware of your own emotional state, because then you can imagine another person's emotional state. You can't do that. You can't have empathy unless you're aware of your own emotional state. So
Yes.
it's a really
And
good point, Liz.
yes, and teaching kids emotional intelligence is labeling your own
Right.
emotions as well. It all ties in, right? And so
Yep.
I think it's very important for kids to hear, I feel this right now, and so this is why I'm acting this way. And
Yeah.
then you can caveat that with, now, that doesn't make my behavior necessarily okay. I mean, I guess, and I'm thinking in terms of like, I get angry and I snapped, right? And I
Mhm.
yelled at my kids. You say, I'm sorry. I was angry and I made a poor choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Acknowledge your own emotional state. I agree.
yeah. Or I think it's okay to tell kids, I feel overwhelmed right now. I feel stressed and I need space to myself. I need you to let me be in this room for myself for 2 seconds to gather myself. It's important to tell kids that, to tell kids how you feel because it teaches them emotional intelligence.
Yeah. I think, as we kind of the takeaway, I like to think about takeaways.
Mhm.
And as we've talked about this, I think I've realized, after COVID, how many years, I mean, COVID's still going on, but we
Right.
have, 2 or 3 years of COVID. I think that being afraid, and well, and then we have all the school shootings, things like that, or the,
Mhm.
mass shootings, and the way things like that are often portrayed in media, I believe the intent is to make people afraid. And so
Mhm.
we have to fight that, because really most of our lives, we go throughout our lives and we have no reason to be afraid.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so I think one of the things that we have to combat is that fear of others and fear
Mm-hmm.
of being different. But if you think about it, I think it might be one of the things that we have to work with our kids on because, when they close the schools or, said you have to wear masks and things like that. I think that the part of our population that suffer the most is certainly going to be our children, our
Mm-hmm.
school-aged children. I think
Yes.
even the APA, which is the American Pediatrics Academy, has come out and recognized that that was a big mistake
Mm.
to do that just because of the ramifications, because I think what it does is it increases fear.
Yeah.
Anyway, off topic, back to, people who are differently abled, don't be afraid of them.
Yeah.
That's the takeaway.
Yeah. I mean,
There's no
interact with
reason
them.
to be afraid of them.
No, there really isn't. I mean, just go interact with them, go
Yeah,
talk to them, have a
yeah,
conversation, find out something new. I think that's the best medicine.
yes.
And an always safe bet is just smile. You can't
Yes.
go wrong smiling at someone. Yeah,
I
if
agree.
if all else fails, just smile, right? I mean, wouldn't
Yeah.
life be so much better if everybody just smiled?
More, yes. I
Yeah,
agree.
smiled more. There are reasons not to smile. Let's be realistic here. But if all else fails, I mean, smiling is a universal language.
Yeah, it's
It's
true.
something that everybody can always understand is a smile. All right, so next week we are going to delve back into the topic of relationships. It's our favorite topic and we haven't done it in a while. So we're going to talk about relationship success. What makes a relationship successful? All right, we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.